role at my institution. And when I was asked to kind of do a talk on cannibalism, I know my research on this is a few years old, but it kind of got me thinking about the next steps and kind of what I wanted to do to try and revitalize some of that research that had kind of fallen by the wayside whilst I was busy doing lots of admining. So some of this is kind of a bit of a broad overview, trying to contextualize the practice of cannibalism against some of the more recent knowledge of what we know about other hominins. A lot of this, many of you will probably know already. So I hope it's not too boring or sort of just repeating the things that you already know in a different way. And hopefully it will be kind of be interesting to you. Right, let me just, okay. Sorry, let me just go back. Now lost control of my keyboard. There we go. So in terms of just like a brief outline of the talk, I'm just going to kind of try and situate us in time, where we are, then kind of go through our understandings of cannibalism and how we define that in terms of motivation and practice. Kind of give an overview of how we've been able to tell this practice occurred in the archaeological record, and particularly in the Paleolithic, and how they have been interpreted by excavators and sort of off the huge body of work that's emerged in this field really in the last kind of 20 years or so. And then I'm going to try and attempt to place the kind of the act of cannibalism and the archaeological Paleolithic examples of it, and I'm really focusing it on a European case base here, in a broader context of behavioural and cognitive complexity. And then I'll kind of just throw some ideas out there towards the end. So I'm hoping it will be coherent and kind of make sense as we go through. So in terms of human evolution, as I'm sure you all know, the hominin record goes back at least 7 million years to the split with the last common ancestor with chimpanzee, somewhere around 7 million. And all mammals practice cannibalism. So although in terms of the Paleolithic, kind of clear-cut case examples of cannibalism really are in the last million years or so, I would not be surprised if we did find evidence of cannibalism stretching further back in time. But at the moment, it's kind of in the last million years that we start to see most of the evidence for cannibalism. So it might be useful just to kind of understand what cannibalism is and how we define it. So in its very broadest sense, cannibalism is a personal animal that eats any type of tissue of another individual of its own kind. And the word cannibalism describes a huge range of behaviors and intentions across a number of different species. In humans, we typically have about 7 basic definitions of cannibalism. The first kind of example is nutritional necessity or survival cannibalism. So this is where obviously plane crashes, shipwrecks and things, and people resort to cannibalism as a last sort of case scenario to survive there. There's psychotic or criminal cannibalism, and probably the most famous example of this would be Hannibal Lecter. So that's either the film version for those who are sort of my age or older, or the TV version for the younger crowd. Take your pick, both are excellent examples to kind of go from there. There's also aggressive or warfare cannibalism, and this is where people could eat the remains of the vanquished, either as a way of denigration or also as a way of kind of honoring their prowess in battle and that kind of thing. So it depends on the social cultural context there. There is spiritual or ritual cannibalism, and this can do with human sacrifice, but also can incorporate funerary cannibalism in terms of honoring the dead and sort of imbibing bits of them to keep their memories alive within you as you move forward, or using sort of human sacrifice and cannibalism there to exhort the gods to do whatever it is that you need them to do. There's also then, what's happened? Sorry, gastronomic or dietary cannibalism. So this is where the cannibalism act just occurs as part of the normal dietary cycle, as part of your normal diet and normal intake. There's nothing sort of abnormal about the use of or eating of cannibalism. So one kind of example of this sometimes maybe is when people eat the placenta after giving birth and that kind of thing. That can be classified as gastronomic or dietary cannibalism. And then there's medicinal cannibalism, where people eat sort of parts of human remains to gain some medicinal benefit. So this was quite common in sort of the European Victorian period, where people would kind of drink from skull cups and eat bits of pounded mummy and things like that. So those are kind of in our species, kind of in the modern world. These are kind of the range of motivations and intentions behind the act of cannibalism that we are quite happy to accept. There is complexity to this behavior, and it changes with context. It also changes in terms of motivation, whether you're dealing with endo or exo cannibalism, or intra or intergroup cannibalism. So whether you're eating a member of your own social group, or whether you're eating somebody who belongs to a different group. And you can apply these different levels of motivation and intention depending on that kind of background, cultural context that we sit in. And this kind of level of complexity around the treatment of the dead is in Homo sapiens sort of not really questioned, really. People are just curious, perhaps, the motivation, but the fact that we can apply all these different levels of complexity is not really questioned at all. I'll come back to that point in a moment. When we think about then looking for the evidence of cannibalism in the archaeological record, and specifically the Paleolithic record, there's about 13 common signatures that you can look for modifications on hominin or human remains, ranging from lack of a cranial base, the virtual absence of vertebrae, cut and chop marks. So this is probably the most common indicator that you might have cannibalism or kind of processing of that hominin skeleton. And depending on the location of the cut marks, in terms of their arrangements, whether they are at butchery points or are scraped along long bones, for example, or across the skull, which might indicate cleaning or additional processing, the presence of the cut or chop mark and where they are located is important to sort of trying to understand the motivation of what those people were doing when they were leaving those marks. Other indications for cannibalism are long bone breakage to get to the marrow. Also, how the hominin remains have been treated in terms of their discard after they've been eaten. Have they been, all those human remains or hominin remains, kind of kept separate from and treated in a different way? For example, Goff's Cave, where the skulls and some of the arm bones have been decorated, and the skulls have been not decorated but intensely cleaned to show there's kind of a handling of those skulls over time, or are they just discarded along with the rest of the faunal remains, as like we see at kind of other sites? So how the hominin or human remains are dealt with is also a key indicator to the attitude, perhaps, that those engaging in the act treated or saw that the people being eaten. And then there are scraping marks, peeling, percussion marks, and that kind of thing. And then probably the most kind of obvious, but not recognized for a long time, there are also human tooth marks on, sorry, it should come up. Yeah, human tooth marks have been identified on certain remains. So that's kind of a clear-cut evidence that these have been, those remains were processed for consumption. And we'll come back to a bit later as to other types of processing of human remains, for example, for secondary burial and that kind of thing, excarnation and so on. So, it's not just, I think it's also important to note that it's not just one of these signatures that equals cannibalism, but normally a combination of a number of them together gives you the context of how those human and hominin remains have been treated, and therefore that allows us to try and access how we interpret the motivation behind the act of cannibalism. Now, in my paper from 2017, and it doesn't feel like 2017 was that long ago, I was just saying earlier that I think the last 2 years has been an odd space-time continuum of singly the 2 longest years of my life and the 2 shortest years of my life. So I still kind of think I'm in 2019 or 2020 in my mind. I don't know where the last 2 years have gone, really. But in my paper, which is now from 2017, I kind of focused very much on the European Paleolithic record. And from that European Paleolithic record, you can see that the dates of the sites where we have evidence for cannibalism really kind of stretches over the last million or so years. But as I say, given that we are mammals and most mammals engage in cannibalism, I really wouldn't be surprised if this was an older act, part of, it's sort of a part of our kind of normal behavioral repertoire, really, although the motivations for cannibalism will change through time and social and geographic context. But the oldest sites that we kind of know from Europe are from Grandolina with Homo antecessor. Then there's De Larigo, which is kind of question mark to being a Homo erectus site and question mark being ritual cannibalism. There's only one publication I could find on this, so it's quite an obscure publication. That's why there's a question mark there in terms of whether it's ritual or not, because it's just the level of detail around those remains. I haven't been able to kind of find more information about them, other than kind of a very short 2-paragraph interpretation as part of a broader publication. Then we have Neanderthal sites from Mulagursi, El Sidron, Padreles, and Zafaria, and Goyet, which are labeled as nutritional cannibalism. And then Mazjika Cave for warfare cannibalism, and Goss Cave for nutritional and ritual treatment. So that's a kind of the time range. I think the other thing to kind of just draw your attention to is sorry, I don't know what's happening. It's all a bit delayed. Is the range of people who are being, or individuals that are being consumed. It's not just adults, it's not just children, but it typically is sort of through the age range of hominin society. So adults, adolescents, and children, infants. There's also, within the layers that have the cannibalized remains, there are also, sort of faunal remains that have been butchered and consumed, which have cut marks on the skeleton. So it's not like each of these instances also is kind of, there was nothing else in that layer, or there was nothing. These groups had no access to other food, although obviously taking into account the time depth around each of these individual instances is not clear and very coarsely refined. So therefore, our understanding of whether these were consumed as a single unit or individual instances over 10 years, 20 years, 100 years, 1,000, 2,000 years, that kind of resolution is often not clear on the sites. I tended to treat them as a single unit, just as a broad discursive device, but really recognizing that coarseness of time frame is important to kind of really drill down once we want to get to motivation. But the kind of column that I really want you to, and I kind of backwardsly drawn your attention to it before, is kind of the interpretation. And these are interpretations from the original excavations. The dominant form there is that the excavators see the type of cannibalism there related to nutritional or dietary cannibalism as part of that dietary spectrum, rather than ritual. And it's really only when you get to Homo sapiens that you perhaps start to recognize, and within the Magdalenians specifically, that you start to recognize a ritual treatment to the cannibalistic act. Prior to that, it's just part of that dietary extension. So I kind of, my interest in cannibalism started as an undergraduate, persisted into my master's degree, and then I kind of left it aside while I did my PhD, and then kind of came back to it a very long time later. But the kind of thing that always kind of questioned me with there is I just, if we give the label nutritional cannibalism or dietary cannibalism to these acts, I just kind of wanted to try and understand a bit more what that meant in relation to the other animals that were being eaten. So I wanted to try and understand a little bit, how did we stack up from a calorific perspective in relation to a mammoth or a boar or a deer or whatever, just to try and see if that allowed a different way into trying to understand the motivation behind the acts of cannibalism. And the reason why I kind of wanted to do that, sorry, my screen's just delaying again. Here we go. And the reason why I wanted to do that is that, I didn't really find the label nutritional cannibalism terribly enlightening in terms of motivation or intention around the act. And I thought it was a bit ambiguous, and it didn't really clarify what was going on. And sort of there seemed to be a dichotomy, or kind of a juxtaposition between cannibalism and the Paleolithic was either described as nutritional or it was described as ritual. But there wasn't that kind of nuanced engagement around motivation, that I kind of set up in the kind of second or third slide that we were looking at around the different ranges that we have in society and humans today. And that's what kind of spurred me to try and look at this question of cannibalism from a different perspective and try and quantify it in some way, just to see if that allowed us to have a discussion and a conversation around the evidence that we did have in light of this kind of calorie value, and just to see if that kind of lent a lens to look at this question around behavioral complexity across human species and how they engage in attitudes to death, treatment of the dead, and what that might be able to tell us then about the complexity of behavior and society and so on. So when I constructed the kind of nutritional model of the human body, not much had been done on this before. A very brief attempt to be done by Garn and Block in 1979, I think, and it was a brief communication, just sort of saying, giving some calorie values and basically saying we're not very nutritious, but no real depth of information relating to body parts and that kind of thing. So when I came to try and construct my model, there's no primary data collection involved. This was all just off published chemical compositions of the human body, mostly done from the 1950s. I really struggled to find anything more up to date. If people have or know of more up to date sources of information, I think it would be great to kind of rerun this kind of study off that kind of chemical composition of the human body on a more recent data set and a broader data set, because mine was really off just 4 adult males, no females. I couldn't find any chemical composition of the female body, and so on. So this was just off what's published data in terms of how much protein, carbohydrate, or fat is present in various body parts. And if you know how much protein you have and how much fat you have, through a simple conversion of 1 gram of protein equals 4 calories and 1 gram of fat equals 9 calories, you can then work out kind of the calorific value of different body parts. So I hate to just stress, no primary data collection was involved in this. It was all off these kind of all published reports. And from that, I kind of tried to then break down different parts of the human body and assign a calorie value to it based on that gram and fat calculation. And this was quite challenging because in those chemical composition papers, some broke down parts of the body in more detail than others. Some broke them down in ways that weren't comparable. So there was a lot of kind of working out and trying to kind of get the best values that could fit. And some things I couldn't really break down. So for example, the torso and the head here are one lump because that's just how they were recorded in the papers. And there wasn't really a way I could work out to kind of tease out the refinement between the flesh around the head versus that on the torso and elsewhere. But I think it kind of gives a useful heuristic and discursive lens, and really kind of focus on the skeletal muscle as a comparator to the faunal remains, which we'll talk about in a moment. We kind of, I tried to sort of take that whole body approach, including things like the spleen and teeth, which obviously weren't eaten and that kind of thing. Because of the age range of the archaeological sample, I also, if the slide progresses in a moment, tried to scale these calorie values by weight to an adolescent, juvenile, child or infant range to also try and get a clear understanding about the archaeological sample that we were looking at, rather than just taking it all from an adult perspective. And I was puzzled for a long time on how to do this. And actually what kind of tipped it for me is that just after this paper had been published, my first son had just been born, and my wife was spending a lot of time looking at growth charts. And I was just looking at this kind of idly over dinner one day, just sort of staring at the growth chart. And suddenly I thought, oh, wait, you can kind of look at these growth charts around predicted weights and values, and then you can use that to kind of scale the calorie values I had by weight to these different age groups. So I suddenly became very interested in growth charts, but probably not for the reason that my wife thought I did. So I kind of used it in that way. So it's very coarse, and I make no bones about this in the paper itself. This is not a refined model, and it's not a refined technique, but I think it is trying to kind of put it forward as a discursive device to allow us to interrogate the motivations and behaviors around this in a more interesting way. I just want to segue briefly into sort of just how, as a result, when this paper was published, and then off the back of the kind of Ig Nobel award on it too, just kind of how research of this nature, or indeed any archaeological nature, can just take on a life of its own in some mainstream media outlets. So I'm just going to show some pictures of graphics that different mainstream media outlets kind of used to report this publication. It's quite interesting to see a variation. So one source used this diagram, which is basically my own attempt, but kind of condensed into probably a clearer and easier way of representing the calories and so on. This is another one. So different parts of the body in a kind of cartoony form makes it probably a bit less scary. It's sort of interesting. The values tend to be largely correct. Here's another one, so a bit more graphic around how the different organs are represented, and then the kind of values assigned to it. Here's one. It's probably one of my more favorite ones. Some of the graphics of which I had thought of myself, but I quite like this one in terms of how it's represented. Sorry, just have to wait for my slides to catch up again. Here's another example from Nature there. And then you get ones like this, which is just 81,500 calories of meaty goodness. I don't know where that one came from, and sort of some arbitrary labels and a sad smiley face on the diagram. So not a great reporting, but also it's kind of, this work has then gone into really surprising avenues within popular culture and things. So here's an article by Vice titled, "Here's how many humans you would need to hunt to survive the apocalypse." So, just kind of where our research goes, sometimes you have no control over where it is, because the message that I kind of sent with the paper was about behavioral complexity, and as we'll see through, linking this into other human species or lineages, perhaps we should call them now, rather than just focusing on our own complexity, but trying to amplify that I saw, at least in other human groups. And actually that, by and large, was not the message that was taken by the mainstream media, but there we go, just sort of interesting to see where these things take us. Okay, back onto kind of cannibalism then, and the Paleolithic record. So having worked out a way of getting some calorie values out of human body parts, I thought now to compare it to the faunal record, the easiest way to do that is just to compare the protein or the muscle value. So admittedly, again, this ignores the fat values, which are significantly more than the protein values, but it gives us a useful kind of, again, heuristic device by which to scale ourselves in relation to other fauna remains that were found in the same layers as these processed, these butchered hominin remains. So things like mammoth, I know that they return 3,600,000 calories. I kind of posit that our muscle returns 32, somewhere around 32,000. The green bars, just so you know, are what are represented by the silhouettes around us. The yellow are what are equal to the human remains or less than. So everything that's green and white on this table is more than a single human individual. So we can see that, and in many cases, significantly more. So a horse, for example, is 200,000 calories. So a single horse would have provided much more calorific return than an individual. Bearing in mind that most of the archaeological samples were more than a single individual, and bearing in mind the caveat that we don't always have the time depth resolution to know whether they were eaten in a single episode or multiple episodes over time, I thought just kind of simplify things, treat them as a single episode, just to see what the maximum values are. So these are the maximum values. Apologies for this very busy table, but these are the maximum values of the calories that you can see where my mouse is waving. And then I also worked out, how many days that would support a group of about 25 people needing a mix of calorie ranges. So 2,400, that's a modern day calorie equivalent. Then a Neanderthal calorie equivalent estimated that they needed about 4,000 calories a day. And then Pleistocene Homo sapiens, who needed around 3,700 calories a day, and just kind of plotted to see if you took them as a maximum, how many days would these episodes of cannibalism kind of allow a hunter-gatherer group to survive. And generally it's a couple of days, two or three at most. Where you get these big outliers, it's because they have a larger number of individuals attached to it. But when you compare it to single members of fauna that have been hunted and butchered, so the green provide significantly more days worth of calorie for a group of 25 than the Cannibalism Act. The yellow is about the same, and then the white kind of is less. So you still have single individual faunal remains giving a higher calorific return than a group of hominins. And this is interesting, and certainly when the article was being reviewed, very useful comments were back. It's very dangerous to hunt a mammoth or a horse or something, so it might be easier to, if these are hunting episodes, and we'll come on to motivation in a moment, it might be easier to eat or to hunt a group of people versus a single animal. And whilst I can see the logic of that, and I don't disagree that probably did happen sometimes, I do just have a bit of pushback on that, and that even if there's a group of people involved there, they are the same species as the hunters, presumably, so they can think the same way. They are as behaviorally complex. If you have wooden spears or stone tip spears, that they almost certainly do. I don't think that we are just passive. We would sort of lie down as a group passively and sort of say, come and get us. I think there would be some fight back, and we probably are as dangerous as other animals that would be hunted. The other kind of thing to kind of just highlight is that in terms of the number of calories that we do provide, unsurprisingly perhaps, but we provide the same number of calories as you would expect for an animal of our body size and weight. And that's sort of similar to an ibex or a rupicapra or so on. And Sega. So we're actually not a very big animal in comparison to some of these other animals that are being hunted and eaten. And that's kind of interesting, because when I was certainly as an undergraduate and masters and things, sort of anecdotally, you would read things saying how nutritious human brains were and that kind of thing, but actually, we're just part of that continuum of a scale. There's nothing particularly nutritious about us for an animal of our size. So when I started to sort of just look at the maths of this, and purely just from and I'm not someone who's generally very good with maths, but a group of 6 individuals produces significantly less calories than a single mammoth, woolly rhino, or bear, and about the same as a megalosaurus or a muskox. You kind of start to think, okay, well, what then are the motivations for cannibalism? And how can we contextualize this against a broader kind of behavioral perspective? And that's kind of where I want to go for the next kind of hopefully 15 minutes. I hope I don't overrun too much. And for that, we have to start looking beyond just examples of cannibalism within the hominin line. So we know that, I'm just getting confused because there's a slight delay. So when I press the button, nothing changes. And then I press it again and it goes 2 ahead. So apologies that I'm jumping forward and backwards here. But, if we think about motivations for cannibalism for Homo sapiens, and particularly the late Upper Paleolithic and more recent later prehistoric times, we've got no problem with kind of generally associating a variety of intentions and motivations to this act, particularly within the Magdalenians. So Sylvia Bellows and colleagues have done really fantastic work on the Goss Cave assemblage to show the ritual elements there, as well as colleagues working on other Magdalenian sites in the late Upper Paleolithic on France and other mainland Europe sites. Generally, that's uncontended. It's just when we start to think about Neanderthals or Antecessor or even Erectus that it comes down to this. No, it's just nutritional, generally speaking. with little wiggle room there to at least in the older publications to kind of see whether there's a potential for a social cultural context. And this is kind of where we just want to look at kind of that broader behavioral perspective. So when we look at, extant primates and their motivations for cannibalism, which is the slide that hopefully is going to load in a moment, there are varieties of motivation within extant primate groups. Here are just sort of two recent examples of one on the left is an intragroup aggression that ended in cannibalism, and then maternal cannibalism for the one on the right. But really well summarized by Palmier-Saladí and colleagues in their 2012 paper now, but a really useful table that kind of shows that cannibalism on an intra-group level within extant primates kind of there's variety of behavior and practice there. So even within the primate level, we are seeing nuances in the approach to cannibalism, and I think that's an important point to hold in our minds towards the conclusion. Sorry, it's just changing slide again. So what I'm going to do now is just kind of focus a little bit, mostly on Neanderthals, because just so much of our knowledge has really exploded around Neanderthal behavior in the last 10 years, particularly. In that, what I teach to my undergraduates now would have been unimaginable when I was an undergraduate, learning how Neanderthals were supposed to have behaved in terms of what their cognitive and behavioral complexity abilities were. And I know many of you will know this already, but I think it's just useful to kind of see it in the broad contextual round. So when we think about behavioral complexity and cognitive complexity, invariably it comes down to sort of a tick box list of comparisons to Homo sapiens behavior, right? Rightly or wrongly, this is often what happens when we write about this in terms of comparing ourselves to other human lineages. Sorry, it is going to load in a moment, hopefully. But the most kind of famous and iconic image that surrounds this is McBreedy and Brooks's 2000 list, which I'm hoping is going to come up in a second. I don't want to press the button again. Advance. There we go. That kind of shows behavioral complexity develops over a long period of time within Africa. And I think generally this is now, and rightly so, a very much accepted method of that. But when we're thinking about behavioral complexity in Neanderthals or Heidelbergensis or Erectus and so on, it's a list like this that invariably we try and compare behavioral similarities to, and kind of tick them off as to whether how many of these things do these other hominins do. And when I was an undergraduate, very few of these things were ticked off in relation to any other human lineage or species group. I don't know what we're supposed to call ourselves now. I prefer lineage for some reason, but probably a discussion for another talk. But now I think actually most of these kind of behavioral complexity things can be ticked off for Neanderthals, certainly, and increasingly I think we see it more in things like Heidelbergensis. So ochre use, for example, in Neanderthals comes in about 250,000. I know Larry's written about ochre use in Africa at 300,000. So kind of very broadly speaking, it's slightly less than perhaps when Homo sapiens or whatever's kind of, sort of preceding that are developing it in Africa, but certainly it is from 250,000 years ago in Europe. So there's a long history of ochre use there. Interestingly, when it comes to ochre use from an ethnographic perspective, ochre is used first in a decorative function, and then the more practical elements, it's apparently very good at settling an upset stomach, or can be used as part of a mastic if you're making composite weapons. Those kind of functional elements come as a secondary use. That's not, cautious with the use of analogy, of course, but I think that it's interesting to kind of think about the order that the stuff would have appeared in. We also see Neanderthals now generally being accepted to produce complex structures. So here's Brunical Cave in southwestern France. So this is 300 meters from the daylight zone, producing these structures with the stalagmites or stalactites, I forget which, as well as hearth structures there. We don't know what they were doing or how, but the fact that they were constructing and organizing this use of space 300 meters from the daylight zone means that they must have had controlled use of fire to see, and clearly the space meant something to them, whatever that is. But there's social, so at the very least, there's social cultural complexity here in terms of how they are structuring space and using space, which just wasn't really considered feasible for Neanderthals 20 years ago or so. We also now recognize that Neanderthals have cultural variability and complexity. Karen Rubens has done work showing that you've got the Carl-Messer groups and the MTA and the MBT, and you've got different Neanderthal groups producing this, the template of the same artifact, but in cultural kind of styles and shapes. So there's cultural diversity within Neanderthal groups in terms of practice and behavior of tool form. I'm sorry about the lag here. In terms of the production, of jewelry and things, the Chateaubriand is still sort of quite contentious. Frieda Welker's group kind of showed that the Chateaubriand at the Grotte du Rennes seemed to be related to the Neanderthal layers, whereas at Saint-Césaire, the Chateaubriand is not related to Neanderthal layers at all, but related to the Homo sapien layer. So the jury stood out on the Chateaubriand itself, I would say, and I would leave it up to probably individual researchers to see where they fall in that debate. But the interesting thing about the Chateaubriand was always around the production of jewelry and who was making it. And certainly as an undergraduate, I was learning that the Chateaubriand was Neanderthals attempting to copy Homo sapiens, but just not doing it quite as successfully in terms of a technological way. But we now know that from Propina, for example, dated to about 130 to 120,000 years ago, Neanderthals seem to be producing jewelry through white-tailed eagle claws. So that's well before Homo sapiens are in Europe, and that kind of copying effect that is often written about kind of gets taken into account. They're doing this seemingly independently on their own. Neanderthals are also exploiting a range of bird feathers, particularly raptors and corvids. Some arguments are that the modifications on these feathers are just from the butchery process, and that may be so. But even if that is the case, there's still specific selection of species here, which I think is interesting from a behavioral and sociocultural kind of complexity perspective, even if you ignore the potential other uses that you might use bird feathers for. We now, Neanderthals were producing jewelry and using ochre on horse bone and sort of within these shell palettes from about 50,000 years ago in Spain. So there's clearly engagement there beyond, again, pre-Homo sapiens in Europe. And of course, always when it comes to, sorry, I just have to remember what my next slide is. Yes, in terms of rock art, which is always kind of the Rubicon of cognitive, linguistic and behavioral complexity within Homo sapiens. Neanderthals certainly were engraving, and that I think pretty prescient really, as they seem to have invented the hashtag about 38,000 years ago in Gibraltar. But also, we have engravings on the cortex of stone tools from various locations. I'm sure everyone here is familiar with the debates around Neanderthal rock art, but first kind of put forward by Alistair Pike and colleagues. I forget exactly when, I think it was around 2011, who did some U-series dating on a series of Spanish cave sites and identified on these panels that the earliest art, these discs, these circles from El Castillo cave, could have been potentially produced by Neanderthals, because they were really dated to that, I think, 42,000, right at the cusp of that Neanderthal Homo sapiens divide in Europe. I know many of us treated that very cautiously at the time, and then subsequently more work has been done, and they have dated sort of cave art sites to 60,000 in Europe. There has been comeback around this from various colleagues, and also replies to the replies. So like the Chateaubriand, I think probably individual researchers will make their own minds up as to where they fall in this debate. For myself, I really don't have a problem with Neanderthals producing cave art, given that they're also producing jewelry and various other structures, structured use of space and things like that. So, and I think that behavioral complexity is there. It would be more puzzling to me why they wouldn't produce cave art than it is that they do. That's my personal opinion, that I'm just laying my cards out on the table, but I know that people may not agree with that, and that's fine. In terms of more examples of behavioral complexity, or at least diversity, I should probably say, is the actual Neanderthal treatment of the dead itself. So we know that typically Neanderthals in Western Europe and the Near East, there were, now it's pretty broadly accepted that Neanderthals did bury their dead in Western Europe and the Near East. In Eastern Europe, there is some treatment of the dead, and it's a mix of burial, but seems to be more linked to excarnation or secondary burial. And there are debates there about whether that is because within Eastern Europe, Central Europe, predators like cave bear and things seem to have had a greater presence than in Western Europe or the Near East. And in Western Asia, I think the evidence is probably still pretty sparse for us to not really be able to see if there's kind of a difference in practice there. But certainly, although people don't necessarily agree on the motivation for burial, they do seem to be burying their dead in some places and not in others. And some groups are burying and other groups are not. So there is behavioral complexity and diversity in practice there in terms of how the dead are treated. And for me, that's the interesting point, rather than perhaps the argument of whether they were burying or not, or why they were burying. And sort of continuing that theme around treatment of the dead, even within Neanderthals, I would posit that there is variation in the act of cannibalism itself across different sites. So we just wait for the slide to load. I'm sorry about this. When we tested it before, it worked fine. So I'm not sure why it's suddenly sort of stalling and pausing now. Okay, so from the Belgium cave of Troisième Goyette, we have Neanderthal remains that were seemingly cannibalized, butchered, and those remains, some of those remains were turned into bone tools. And more stable isotope work at Goyette shows that the individuals being cannibalized seem to have come from outside of that geographic region. So it's posited that this might be an example of exocannibalism, either by another Neanderthal group or another unknown group of Upper Paleolithic modern humans or hominins, but certainly there seems to be an example of exocannibalism here, where this outside group were eaten and then some of the human remains were turned into bone tools. Elsewhere, and in moving around in time, sorry, just don't know why it's struggling so much. At the site of Mulagursi, in my 2017 paper, I kind of posited or concluded there that I thought that maybe we should look at these examples of cannibalism that were labeled nutritional and see really if there was a social cultural reason would be a better suited starting point, which is great because it prompted research teams to go back to their data sets and really kind of examine it more. And De Fleur and colleagues kind of came back on Mulagursi saying, yeah, we've looked at things and actually, Mulagursi is dated to 5E. We can see kind of a collapse in Neanderthal populations there, so that they do kind of still maintain that this is an example of survival cannibalism due to kind of rapid and radical environmental changes. And I think, I certainly don't see any reason to disagree with that. And I think it's really fantastic that kind of my paper prompted discussion and teams to go back and look at data sets in new and different ways. So great. So survival cannibalism, you've got Neanderthals eating members of other groups and using their remains as bone tools. I think there's some intriguing interpretive lenses that could be taken out of that. Equally, hopefully this will change again. I'm sorry about this delay, everyone. Okay. Looking at the antecessor, because in my paper I kind of suggested that maybe, you know, even within antecessor, it could be social cultural, and that was very much pulling on the work of Antonio Rodriguez Hidalgo and Palaeolithic and colleagues who had written a paper around territory defense and comparing antecessors' engagement with cannibalism to chimpanzee and territory defense, which I still think is a really great paper and a great interpretation. That prompted colleagues to kind of use some of my methodology and amazingly refine it to the antecessor bow plan more, which is great because I wasn't able to do that, but they did. And even more, and this is very rare for me, but they sort of said that they kind of agreed with some of my initial posits around the calorie values. I was very nervous about the calorie values and putting them out there and whether I had, you know, done the calculations correct, but they seem to generally agree. They also took an interesting take and looked at it from an optimal foraging kind of theory. And they kind of came up with the conclusion that maybe cannibalism there should be considered an adaptive strategy from the point of view of optimal foraging theory. And that, you know, especially if the cannibalized individuals were members of the same group as the cannibals and who died by natural causes. So, you know, they kind of conclude that, you know, within Homo antecessor, the cannibalism could be based on solely nutritional considerations. So again, it was just prompting people to go back to data sets, look at them in different ways, from different perspectives, and come up with different analyses. And I think that's a really great discussion that they kind of produce there. But I do still very much like Palaeolithic and colleagues' work around the thinking about antecessor as range expansion and kind of and territory defense and things like that. And if we kind of accept that this is a scenario, then, you know, that I would argue is still kind of socio-cultural motivator rather than just a nutritional one. But, you know, I think there's lots of discussions to be had around this, particularly with earlier hominin work. Other more recent work, which I think has produced really interesting results, comes from Francesca Marginedes and colleagues there, looking at the modifications on skulls and identifying human sort of cannibalized human skulls and comparing the Atapuerca sample to late Upper Paleolithic and Neolithic examples. And you know, what they were showing there is that when you get human skulls that have been processed for a ritual reason, that there is, in terms of the number of modifications and the locations of them, there seems to be a very kind of specific way that you can identify that, which you don't see on the Atapuerca skull. So that kind of perhaps throws the light there that the Atapuerca stuff is more about food or meat, or at least the processing of the skull and things. They're not seeing the dead in the same way that maybe these later Upper Paleolithic Homo sapiens are. And, you know, I think that there's again really fantastic work here, showing that the power that we have now to map all of these modifications and run analyses on them to produce kind of really meaningful and interesting results. It's just really just phenomenal, and just really shows how much a lot, you know, we've kind of how far we've come. So what I'm going to try and do is just very briefly try and pull this my slightly rambling slow talk together in a way that kind of makes sense in terms of our broader understanding about complexity, in terms of what it all means. And this story kind of does go back to what the kind of setting that we were in 17 to kind of 20 years ago, where the main idea about human evolution was pretty simple. You know, we had Homo erectus evolving in Africa, moving into Asia, potentially into Europe. From that erectus population, a group Heidelbergensis evolves in Africa and moves into Europe, potentially Asia. The African Heidelbergensis evolve into Homo sapiens. The European Heidelbergensis evolve into Neanderthals. Then Homo sapiens moves out of Africa, effectively replacing these other populations. And there's at that time thought to be about a 10,000-year overlap in Europe between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. Interestingly, in 2003, Chris had also produced another model based on the antecessor data, which showed that perhaps antecessor was a better contender for the last common ancestor, and then from there you might have kind of a Rhodesiensis or Heidelbergensis population in Africa evolving, and, you know, Neanderthals evolving out of antecessor, then Homo sapiens kind of having that 10,000-year overlap. Interestingly, I think probably most people I was certainly taught version A, and that seemed to be what most people were kind of settling on then. But I think as we all know, kind of the last 20 years has kind of really changed our understanding of that picture in terms of complexity, and particularly in understanding who our last common ancestor is. So by 2012, different new hominin species were found, like Homo floresiensis. We had a refining of the data set to recognize kind of two separate erectus populations in Southeast Asia, a mainland population and a Sunda population. Denisovans and Neanderthals and Homo sapiens seem to have been interbreeding. And that we had Denisovan and Neanderthal DNA in modern human populations outside of Africa, and African populations had a 2% or so integration of an unknown hominin, unknown because we haven't really sampled any DNA from African fossils. So our understanding about human evolution and how these species interacted with each other started to really increase exponentially in terms of complexity there. Still in 2012, Heidelbergensis was generally seen as a favored kind of last common ancestor and antecessor, kind of still kind of an offshoot branch in Europe. By 2019, this had changed even more. The last common ancestor is no longer seen to be Heidelbergensis because from DNA analysis, sort of data, that's now been pushed back to around 700,000 years, about 100,000 years before Heidelbergensis evolves. Now, seemingly the best contender is Homo antecessor, although people will say that cautiously. Naledi, another small-brained, small-bodied hominin, emerges in South Africa with behavioral complexities there. If you sort of take Lee Berger and colleagues' publications in, that they might be burying their dead. There are still these integressions from perhaps early archaic Homo sapiens into later Homo sapiens populations. Denisovans and Neanderthals are not only mating with Homo sapiens, but also with each other. The China archaics, or the Harbin, seems to be a third potential band of human lineage that emerges in Southeast Asia. And you've got Floresiensis and now Luzonensis also on the far end there. So suddenly all these kind of complexity of how all these species kind of merge together has changed, and we've really shifted from this idea that these were individual species that didn't kind of interact much to now kind of seeing this kind of, a very kind of blended, I would suggest, kind of mixing of DNA across these different human lineages. This is my poor attempt to kind of try and characterize this over the last kind of 4.5 million years or so, trying to think about the different permutations and how we might represent this complexity now. But actually, I think Elena Scary and colleagues do this much better. And they do this in an image I'm going to show in a moment, but kind of the background to it is that they suggest the origins of Homo sapiens rather than evolving from a single point in Eastern Africa or Southern Africa, but actually as a multi-regional evolution across the African continent. And, when we look at the archaeological record, we see these kind of slices, these pinpoints in time of these populations. What we don't see is the three-dimensional depth of whether those populations are expanding or contracting or moving or coming to a dead end and so on. And the more I look at this diagram, the more elegant I think it is. And I actually think, if you change the x-axis from just population size to behavior and cognition, I think there's kind of, this is also what's happening across different human lineages and species through time, and that these behavioral complexities are expanding, they're contracting, they're being reinvented at different times and different locations. And it's, we really need to detract ourselves from a very linear view of progression that is kind of ingrained in our understanding of the past. And when you kind of look at, how, behavioral complexity, things like clothing, fire, ochre use, art, when you map that against the archaeological record, just in a timeline, that complexity really does start to come through, I think, in terms of where it falls, and in the brain size there at the bottom. And this was an idea that John McNabb and I were kind of suggesting initially in 2015, thinking about orders of intentionality and different groupings of species in terms of how variable they might be in their cognitive complexity. And I kind of tried to refine that a bit in a more recent paper, showing that, a single species isn't a single level of behavioral complexity or a single level of cognitive complexity, but there's variation within populations and within species across time and space. And what this means then is that when you look at human evolution, we are complex. And I think we need to embrace that level of complexity. Clearly, you know, aDNA has really revolutionized the way we understand the last kind of 500,000 years of human evolution. And if that kind of level of behavioral complexity and interbreeding and so on is happening here, then it probably is also happening further back in time too. I would say there's no reason I can think of why it wouldn't be like that. So I think we kind of need to embrace that complexity of perspective and perhaps stop trying to simplify the story to kind of just match either our preconceived expectations or just expectations that we have just held for a very long time in terms of how we look at things. So to conclude, in terms of cannibalism, you know, ultimately, I think we will never know really the motivations behind acts of Paleolithic cannibalism or prehistoric cannibalism, particularly in deep time, because, you know, the specific instances of that act are lost to us and we don't have the resolution to pick it up. So undoubtedly, I think every episode is going to have its own specific cultural context and reason for consumption. In some instances, that will just be meat for meat's sake approach, you know, survival cannibalism, or part of that dietary process. And that will either be people who are in your group who die, and perhaps you don't have to go hunting that day, or it will be people from outside your group. Undoubtedly, those instances exist. We may even be lucky enough to have picked up one or two of them in the archaeological record itself. But given all of that complexity around not just our interactions with different human lineages, but also that broad kind of behavioral complexity that we're starting to recognize now in Neanderthals, let alone, I haven't even touched on Denisovans, but, you know, if we're interbreeding with them, my assumption would be that presumably they are also of a similar behaviorally complex position to Neanderthals and us, in order for kind of those attraction rules to kind of to take a part. So I think really, you know, we have to start kind of resetting our default position, just thinking about, we should assume behavioral complexity as the default rather than simplicity. And that's kind of our baseline point. And I think I've written it there probably more eloquently than I've said it, but I'm also just conscious I've now spoken for a very long time. So thank you very much for listening to me. And I hopefully there'll be some questions if I haven't bored everyone to tears by this point. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, James. That was a really interesting talk. Certainly a lot to digest there. Does anyone have any questions?
Yes, hello. I have a question. When you're looking at so many different articles with so much data, how do you determine whether an article it has a valid weight, or whether it's just a compilation of information that was cobbled together? How can you tell whether the authors created and published a paper of good science versus very weak science? How can you tell the strength of a paper?
Thanks, Walter. That's a really good question, and it's a really hard one, I think, for any of us to answer. I will have a go. Part of it, I think, comes from your own experience of research and your own knowledge around things, and you will always bring that to bear when you read papers and work, in terms of, does this chime where you kind of see things moving, particularly if it's about, you know, perhaps increasing behavioral complexity and things like that. You do have to read things with an element of skepticism, but I think increasingly, perhaps maybe wrongly, I tend to read things more with an element of optimism, and that I want to understand and embrace people's arguments and decision making and kind of what they're posing, rather than just dismissing them, because I want to try and I think diversity of opinion, right, you know, whether it's right or wrong, is still useful in terms of trying to understand this question around complexity. And the more complex we realize things are, the more perspectives I think we have to take into account. Whether you then make a judgment call on whether you think that's something useful or whether it's not, I admit, you know, I'm not an expert in all things. I'm not an expert in dating, for example, and stuff like that. So I do kind of then look to colleagues who are more experts in that, in terms of how they react to papers when I discuss it with them. You know, what do you think about the techniques on there? Did that work? and kind of take on board what they say, and that kind of feeds into my level of acceptance or skepticism. Talking about it with other people, I think, is also useful to kind of just see where things are. But generally, I think I'm trying to be. I definitely want to be more open to ideas and diversity of opinion, because I just think you never know within that. Even a bad idea could have a nugget of something that's good, right? So you don't want to chuck everything out, but you want to kind of glean what you can, because it's not a simple story about how we evolve or how other human lineages or species evolve or anything like that. It's increasingly messy and muddy, and I don't know, the only way I can think we can try and make sense of it is to kind of take all of those perspectives. But that I haven't really answered your question very well, I'm afraid, because it's a really challenge. That's probably the hardest question I've ever been asked.
Well,
So I'm
just
sorry for my non-answer.
It's fine. I was just wondering whether you delved into, let's say, a statistical analysis when you put your data together, whether you do a meta-analysis of, let's say, a number of findings in an archaeological site. As I learn more about archaeology, I find that the science of archaeology is quite different from other sciences like physics, where you have mathematics and equations, or medicine, where there are clinical trials.
Yeah, you're right, and I think certainly across the discipline of archaeology, I think there's a balance of people who are very number orientated, and a balance of people who are kind of very perspective orientated. Perhaps that might not be the right word, but kind of from that human bit. Some of it's for me, and this is probably going to either ruin my ruin any reputation I may have had with, or credibility with anyone. Some of it's about gut intuition around kind of some of the things. Does that making sense with what I know about in this time period elsewhere or in similar sites? And if I don't know those things, then I have to research them, and you're kind of always comparing them to what's around it, if that makes sense, and you're kind of trying to work out there. But I mean, there are data scientists, archaeological data scientists, who are way more advanced and better at this kind of stuff than I am. And if there are any here, please chime in, because you'll probably be able to answer Walter's question better.
All right, well, thank you for your answer.
I'm sorry it was no use to you at all.
No, it was. It gave me some more perspective.
That's great. We have a couple more questions in the chat now as well, if you don't mind. I notice we've gone over a little bit. So Lydia asks, can I please check from your diagram, did I line part with that of the Neanderthals between 800 and 500,000 years ago? Can we be more accurate? If not, do you think we might know a lot more soon?
Sorry, Dylan, I was just looking at the chat trying to find the question too. And can you just say it again? Because I can't see it in there.
Yes, sure. From your diagram, did our line part with that of Neanderthals between 800 and 500,000 years ago? Can we be more accurate? If not, do you think we might know a lot more soon?
Yeah, okay, thanks. Lydia's question has just come up there. So, I mean, that really is based on some of the ADNA analysis, I think by Mayer, and I think it was 2016, 17, somewhere around there, which kind of intimated that the last common ancestor we shared with Neanderthals was somewhere around 650 to 700,000. And because of that, the last common ancestor being kind of, and I think that time frame is a genetic time frame rather than a fossil one, if that makes sense, because there's a difference between the archaeological dating and a genetic dating on things. So that last common ancestor kind of got pushed back from 400,000 to 750,000. So I think, yes, we can be more accurate if we find some fossils dated to those periods in areas that are there that show kind of maybe elements of kind of transition there. But at the moment of current day, unless kind of people learn to kind of process through Bayesian analysis or whatever, and again, this is for other people who are who are much better at this kind of thing than I am. We will get better as we align the DNA dating to the archaeological dating. That's kind of my only answer for you there. So I hope soon, because you know, people like Chris Stringham will know a lot more. I think I saw his name in the chat than me, but you know, I have every optimism that I think, you know, these things we're only going to start to know more and more and more, and you know, it's going to be a real challenge to assimilate that and think about what it means for our own evolution.
Excellent. We have another question from Gabriel in the chat. Are there micronutritional differences between mammalian tissues?
Thanks, Gabriel. So do you mean in terms of things, you know, like say around differences in chemical composition, like, I don't know, like potassium or something like that? Is that what you mean by micronutritional?
And I wondered if it may have driven the need to eat, it's not the calorific return, which may have driven the need to eat human flesh, but some lack in nutrients. Yeah,
that's a really great question. Thank you. And my honest answer is I don't know, but I assume that there are, you know, different parts of the body are going to have those things. Whether that's a driver, I mean, I'm not sure how sensitive we are to understanding that we need a particular nutrient and where we can find that source. I mean, I know primates and things crave vitamin C, and therefore, you know, we'll go after fruits and things. Whether that's kind of mechanisms happening with, say, ancestors or something like that, I really don't know. Wouldn't throw it out, but I think it would be quite hard for us to access the data to try and see whether that's the case. And I think probably the only way that we could do that is to try and get a better breakdown of the chemical composition of the human body. So if again, I'll throw my plea out. If people know where that is, I'll really be glad to see it. Thank you for your question, Gabrielle.
And we have another question in the chat. Do you think climate change could also play some role in preservation of signatures of cannibalism? Any isotopic clue?
Yeah, so I mean, I think in terms of climate change, I mean, that's going to impact fossil preservation anyway. And generally, if the fossils preserve, the signatures on them will also preserve pretty well. Then the question is how you interpret marks on bone, whether that is deliberate cut marks from stone tools, or is that trample from animal hooves and that kind of thing. So climate change, yes, will play an issue in preservation, but no more so than if it was, you know, what you would apply to at a general fossil level. I would say it's not going to impact whether the marks are there and whether they preserve and see. But I am more a lithic specialist rather than an anatomist, so happy to be corrected there. Isotopes, I think if you can extract isotope stuff, then that's great. And we saw from the Goyet cave example where the isotope work was done, showing that the Neanderthals being consumed were exo, so from outside of that region. If we can get isotope data from stuff, then yeah, absolutely. I think that will be really interesting, and it shows up some really a more nuanced ability to kind of interpret those cannibalism acts than just having the mark there. So, but you know, I think that's whether the isotopes preserve sufficiently, and if we have the teeth and things to pull them from.
Excellent. Do we have any more questions from anyone? It doesn't look like it. Well, in that case, I think we'll wrap up there. Thank you all for coming, and thank you very much, James. That was a really fascinating talk. Really enjoyed that. Please, everyone, join us next week, where we have a talk from Professor Scott Ortman on the social reactors project of the evolution of human networks. So thank you very, very much, everyone, for coming.
Thanks for having me, everyone, and thanks for listening to me ramble on for an hour. Thank you.
Been very worth it.